The first human step on Mars would probably be remembered as one of the great achievements in human history. A boot presses into red dust. A pale sky hangs over the landing site. The habitat sits a short walk away, bright against the empty ground. Reach the base, close the hatch, take off the suit, and for a moment Mars seems like a place where people could actually live. But that is only how Mars looks from the outside. The real problem begins inside the body. On Earth, we barely notice the planet doing its work. Gravity pulls on bone and muscle in the way the body expects. Air presses around us without effort. The sky takes the worst of the radiation before it reaches the ground. And when something breaks, a machine, a water line, or a person, help is usually close by. Mars takes most of that away. So the real test would not be the landing. It would come after the excitement of reaching Mars wears off, when the crew has to sleep there, work there, and stay strong enough to keep going. Not for a few days, not for a short visit, for years, on a world with weak gravity, useless air, and radiation the body was never built to take. That is the harder question behind a human Mars base. Machines may keep people alive there, but can they keep an Earth-built body healthy enough and long enough for Mars to become a place humans can live on beyond the first short mission? By the end of this video, you will understand what Mars would really ask of the human body, why staying alive is not the same as staying healthy, and why the first base on Mars may be less like a new home than the longest medical experiment humans have ever attempted. If you enjoy exploring questions like this with me, subscribing helps others find the channel too. Sharing the video helps even more. Let's begin. Mars often looks more familiar than it really is. A curiosity or perseverance image can show a horizon, layered hills, dunes, frost, and a sky bright enough to suggest weather rather than vacuum. NASA's Mars Facts page adds more details that tempt the imagination toward comfort. There are seasons, there are dust storms. A Martian day is close to an Earth day. Sunrise and sunset still exist. That collection of facts makes the planet feel like a severe version of somewhere we already know. The body does not live in scenery. It lives in pressure, chemistry, heat flow, mechanical loading, shielding, microbes, and rescue time. Mars changes every one of those conditions at once. Its atmosphere is mostly carbon dioxide and far too thin for unprotected lungs. Its temperatures swing across a range that forces people into carefully managed habitats and suits. Its dust is persistent. Its atmosphere and the loss of a global magnetic field leave much less protection from radiation than Earth provides. Even the daily pull under your feet drops to about 3/8 of Earth gravity. The place keeps enough familiar visual cues to tempt us while withholding most of the support a human body actually uses. That changes the meaning of stepping outside. On Earth, a person walking into a cold desert still remains inside a planet that provides pressure, breathable air, one full gravity, and a radiation environment the body evolved within. On Mars, a person in a suit carries those missing background conditions on their back. The helmet air is mixed and pressurized for the lungs, pumps move heat and moisture away from the body, and the visor stands between exposed tissue and the outside light and particle environment. Every safe breath and every tolerable temperature depend on machinery staying inside tolerance. The suit is not adventure gear, it is a small artificial Earth wrapped tightly around a body that cannot negotiate directly with the world outside. That dependence does not end at the airlock. NASA's human health and performance material is useful here because it strips the fantasy out of settlement language. Human beings on a Mars mission are operating within 5 interacting hazard families: radiation, isolation, and confinement, distance from Earth, altered gravity, and hostile or closed environments. The value of that framework is not the list itself. The value is the reminder that the body never meets these pressures one at a time. A long EVA exposes dust and radiation while using muscles that may already be underloaded. A vision change means more when specialist care is delayed. Habitat microbes matter more when immunity is already living under stress. The hazards lean on each other. That is why the familiar survival question is too small. Could humans survive on Mars is really asking whether engineering can prevent fast death. That is a low bar. A crew member could be alive and useful while the skeleton keeps drifting away from Earth maintenance and daily exercise turns into ongoing repair work. They could finish tasks and still live with narrower blood pressure tolerance, partly unresolved headward fluid effects, a habitat microbiome that has shifted around them, and symptoms that feel riskier simply because expert care is far away. Survival can arrive before bodily stability, and stability in one system can hide drift in another. Mars gravity makes that distinction harder to hear because it sounds like a compromise between danger and normality. It would let people stand and walk, dust would fall instead of floating, tools would have weight again, the body would regain many cues that transit crews lose in microgravity. Yet that same number, 0.38 g, is also one of the biggest scientific unknowns in the story. Bones have never spent decades under that exact load. Blood vessels have never adapted to it across a lifetime. Eyes, muscles, immune systems, and recovery loops have never been measured there over years. The planet gives enough downward pull to feel solid and still may fall below what several systems need for long-term maintenance. The right mental picture then is not Mars as a desert waiting for better gear. It is Mars as a place where Earth stops doing its background labor. Pressure has to be held inside walls. Water has to circulate through a loop the crew maintains. Radiation becomes a planning constant because the planet does not screen it away. Gravity stops being a given and becomes an unresolved experiment. Medical care begins with local judgment and only later reaches remote support. The habitat does not cancel that picture. It sits inside it. A crew may eat dinner in shirt sleeves on Mars and still be living inside a biology problem that Earth solved for free every second of every day. One ordinary scene makes the point better than any grand summary. Imagine a crew member coming back from surface work. The suit has done its job, but the return trip is really a chain of transfers. Dust has to stop at the airlock instead of reaching shared air and surfaces. Pressure and oxygen have to be restored without pushing the life support loop outside its usable band. The person stepping inside also brings a body that is still adapting to weaker gravity and still carrying whatever radiation dose the day added. Nothing dramatic has happened. Yet the whole scene depends on artificial layers doing what Earth once did quietly. That is the real beginning of the Mars body story. The main question is not whether Mars is instantly lethal without protection. Everyone already knows that. The main question is what happens after the first layer of protection works. Once the crew has air, water, food, walls, and routines, does the body settle into a new durable baseline, or does it keep paying small hidden costs that accumulate across months and years? NASA's hazard framework, the Mars Environmental Record, and decades of human spaceflight evidence all point toward the same answer. Mars would keep testing the body from inside the settlement as much as outside it. That also explains why Mars remains so different from a submarine, a polar base, or any other hard environment on Earth. Those places are dangerous, but they still sit within a planet that provides 1 g thick air, open ecology, and fast evacuation if the machinery fails. Mars combines enclosure with planetary absence. Even successful engineering has to work against the fact that the surrounding world is not participating in human health at all. The body therefore meets Mars as a stack of missing baselines, not as one dramatic threat outside the window. That difference matters because it changes the burden placed on every ordinary success. On Earth, a working room is a small achievement resting on a huge planetary foundation. On Mars, the room itself has to provide more of the foundation. A successful meal, a successful night of sleep, or a successful day of work is evidence that many artificial systems stayed in alignment for a little longer. That is an extraordinary accomplishment. It is also why a Mars settlement would be testing the body even when daily life appears calm and routine. The practical consequence is that Mars would ask people to think like both residents and systems engineers at the same time. They would live in rooms that feel familiar while knowing those rooms remain tiny islands of human compatibility inside a planet that offers none for free. That is a very different relationship from anything most of us call home. It is also the background condition that gives every later body system its unusual weight. That is why even the calmest successful day on Mars would still be biologically unusual. The planet outside the wall would remain as non-human as it was on the day of landing. The body inside would simply be better supported against it for another cycle. Picture a quiet room on Mars. Fans hum behind the walls. Condensation is being tracked. A meal warms in a compact galley. Someone checks the seal on an inner hatch after a surface excursion. The scene would look calm. It might even look domestic. That is why it matters. The room feels ordinary only because a large amount of engineering is performing silent body support in the background. On Earth, ordinary indoor life sits on top of an already habitable planet. On Mars, ordinary indoor life would be one of the most artificial states humans have ever created. Pressure is the cleanest place to see the difference. Most people almost never think about pressure unless they fly, dive, or climb a mountain. The air around us is so stable that it becomes invisible. It holds liquid water where the body needs it, lets lungs exchange gases without effort, and spares skin and eyes from negotiating with the environment every second. Mars does not provide any of that on its own. Outside pressure is far too low, so a habitat wall on Mars is not a wall in the Earth sense. It is a membrane separating a human pressure world from a surface that cannot host exposed human biology. That turns simple maintenance into a medical condition. A leak is not only a structural fault, it is a breathing problem waiting to happen. A valve that drifts out of tolerance is not only an engineering annoyance, it can change air composition for everyone sharing the same loop. Carbon dioxide removal becomes part of keeping judgment, sleep, and respiration inside the human range. Humidity control matters because water in the air affects comfort, equipment, and microbial behavior. Water recycling matters because the settlement is reusing part of what the crew exhales, sweats, washes, and discards. Inside that closed cycle, chemistry becomes intimate very quickly. NASA's human body in space material helps here because it frames life support in the calm language of systems rather than drama. That calm can hide how profound the dependence really is. On Mars, the room would be doing some of the work the planet does for free on Earth. It would maintain pressure, supply breathable gas, remove waste gases, manage heat, move water, and hold contamination inside barriers the body can tolerate. If any of those jobs weaken, the effect crosses from infrastructure to physiology almost immediately. A habitat in that sense is closer to an external organ system than to a building. The airlock makes the point in miniature. On Earth, opening a door usually means changing where you are. On Mars, opening a door means changing whether the environment around you can support liquid water in tissues, usable breathing, and a safe temperature range. A suit cycle is a medical transfer as much as a travel routine. When a crew member comes back inside, the base has to restore the person to the artificial pressure world without also importing too much dust, too much chemical contamination, or too much wear on the life support machinery. That transfer happens over and over. It becomes part of the daily rhythm of settlement life. Air composition adds another layer of dependence. On Earth, rising carbon dioxide in a room is usually a ventilation issue with lots of surrounding atmosphere available to dilute mistakes. On Mars, the crew lives inside the inventory it carries or generates. Scrubbers, seals, storage tanks, and monitoring systems become part of ordinary breathing. A small drift in performance matters more because the buffer is smaller and the environment outside the wall offers no quick relief. The body therefore lives one step closer to engineered chemistry than most humans ever have. Water shows the same logic from another angle. On Mars, water is drinking supply, hygiene, thermal management, food preparation, agriculture support, and a source for other life support processes. Every liter that circulates through the habitat is part of a closed or semi-closed loop. That means cleanliness is not only about comfort, it is about keeping the internal chemistry of the settlement compatible with kidneys, skin, lungs, digestion, and the equipment that supports them. A purification problem is a health problem early, not late. The emotional meaning of routine tasks changes once that dependence is clear. Cleaning a suit is no longer ordinary order. It is part of preserving the breathing environment. Swapping filter media is not invisible maintenance. It is direct protection for lungs, eyes, and the machines that keep the habitat usable. Checking condensation control is not a dry system's core. It affects corrosion, microbial growth, and the overall stability of the indoor environment. What looks like housekeeping from a distance is often body protection up close. This is where the line between engineering and medicine begins to collapse. If gravity turns out to be too low for full musculoskeletal maintenance, exercise devices become medical infrastructure. If shielding mass has to be placed carefully to reduce dose where people sleep, architecture becomes medical infrastructure. If air handling has to catch dust and soil chemistry before it reaches shared surfaces, ventilation becomes medical infrastructure. If water from local ice or regolith has to be detoxified before it reaches food loops, resource processing becomes medical infrastructure. Mars does not let the support systems sit quietly in the background. They enter the story of the body itself. Even a perfectly run habitat would still have limits. It can preserve pressure, it can keep oxygen and carbon dioxide in usable ranges. It can lower temperature swings and reduce dust intrusion. It can cut some radiation exposure compared with standing out on open ground. What it cannot do by itself is restore 1G open ecology, thick planetary shielding, or immediate medical rescue. Safe indoors would still differ from normal indoors in ways the body could continue to register for years. That is the key distinction to hold on to. A habitat can create survivable conditions before it creates Earth-like conditions. It can make the crew productive before it makes the body fully comfortable. It can keep people healthy enough for work while still leaving unanswered questions about long-term stability. The machinery may perform beautifully, and the biology may still be living in a narrowed version of home. Once pressure has been solved this way, the next unresolved variable becomes impossible to ignore. Gravity returns, but it returns in a reduced form, and the body has never had to live inside that exact compromise for long. That is why a Mars base should be imagined less as a building and more as a boundary that must keep proving itself. The proof is not in whether it looks solid on the outside. The proof is whether pressure stays stable, filters stay ahead of contamination, water chemistry stays inside human limits, and the crew's routine remains biologically supportable month after month. A habitat can be a triumph of design and still leave the body living one mechanical failure away from a rapidly changing environment. That proximity to failure changes how every ordinary room should be understood. It also changes the meaning of comfort. A comfortable room on Earth invites forgetfulness because the outside world still supports life if the lights go out for a while. A comfortable room on Mars would invite forgetfulness at exactly the point when vigilance still matters. Fans, scrubbers, seals, water processors, suit interfaces, and contamination barriers would all remain part of the body's support web, even during the most peaceful moments. Pressure therefore turns comfort itself into a managed state rather than a natural default. That is one more reason the habitat belongs inside the physiology story, not outside it. 3/8 of Earth's gravity sounds reassuring for a simple reason. It is clearly more than zero. You can imagine walking instead of floating. Tools would fall when dropped, dust would settle, sleep would happen against a mattress instead of inside straps and restraints. The horizon would feel more like a place and less like an interior volume. That is enough to make many people round the number upward in their minds. Mars begins to sound like a partial return to normal. The body is not listening to the sound of the number, it is answering the load itself. NASA's Mars Facts page gives the value plainly, about 0.38 G. The difficult part is everything that follows from it. Human physiology evolved inside 1 G. Human space medicine has accumulated decades of evidence from microgravity, especially through the International Space Station. That evidence shows what happens when the ordinary loading pattern weakens too much. Bones lose density, muscles lose size and strength, blood volume changes, orthostatic tolerance changes, fluids shift upward, vision can be affected. Mars sits somewhere between the familiar planet that built the body and the near-weightless environment that stresses it. That middle state is exactly what makes it so hard to interpret. There is no population on Earth that has lived for years at Mars gravity. There is no generation of people born, aging, working and recovering there. There is no long dataset showing whether the skeleton, circulation, eyes and immune system eventually stabilize. Every serious Mars health argument has to admit that gap. We know a great deal about 1G. We know a great deal more than we once did about microgravity. We know very little from direct experience about the exact gravity Mars would impose on the body for years at a time. That is why the Texas Tech Review, with the blunt title "The Partial Gravity of the Moon and Mars," appears insufficient to maintain human health matters. The value of that paper is not that it proves doom. It does not. Its value is that it refuses false comfort. The authors argue that current evidence does not justify confidence that Moon or Mars gravity will preserve human health over long durations. That is a careful statement, but it is a heavy one. It means the core threshold itself remains unresolved. Mission planners can design for survival before science can guarantee stability. Animal work gives the uncertainty a more physical shape. A Science Advances study reported that about 0.33 G mitigated muscle atrophy in rats, while about 0.67 G preserved muscle force and bone more effectively. Mars lies close to the lower value, not the higher one. That does not turn the rat experiment into a direct forecast for settlers. Rats are not humans. The timescale was shorter than any real Mars settlement. The experimental conditions were controlled in ways that life on another planet never is. Still, the study teaches an important lesson. Partial gravity can help long before it fully protects. Better than zero does not automatically mean enough. That lesson matters because the body is not waiting on one master threshold. A load that feels solid under the feet may still be too low for bone remodeling, while circulation or eye pressures may settle into a different compromise entirely. Mars could relieve some parts of the microgravity problem and still leave others only partly solved. The same 0.38 G may feel generous to daily movement and incomplete to long-term maintenance. This is why Mars should be imagined less as a single answer and more as a cluster of unfinished negotiations inside the body. The visible part of life on Mars could make the problem easy to miss. A crew might move well on the surface. They might stand around a work table, carry tools, sleep with a mattress pulling back at them, and feel much more ordinary than they did during transit. Surface footage would show recognizable motion. That footage could be true and still hide a physiological tax. People often assume that if movement looks normal enough, the underlying system must be close to normal too. Human spaceflight evidence argues against that shortcut. Bodies can remain functional while several slower changes continue in the background. NASA's own framing supports that caution. Altered gravity remains one of the 5 major hazard families even after arrival. The category does not disappear because the ship landed. That means the agency itself is not treating partial gravity as a solved reward for reaching the surface. It is treating it as a new environment that may be better than microgravity and still medically consequential. Improvement matters. It simply does not close the case. There is also a planning consequence hidden inside this uncertainty. If Mars gravity proves incomplete, exercise stops being a wellness habit and becomes a structural requirement of settlement life. Habitat design has to invite loading instead of saving every step. Work schedules have to leave room for fatigue, recovery, and countermeasure time. Monitoring also becomes a search for slow drift rather than a search for dramatic illness. In that sense, gravity reaches into architecture and scheduling long before a settler ever calls it a medical issue. The uncertainty reaches forward in time too. Mars might support ordinary function for years and still leave the skeleton or circulation slightly underprotected the whole time. That kind of deficit would be easy to miss early because people could look strong, work well, and treat the routine as proof that the threshold problem is solved. The warning may come later, in slower recovery, thinner reserve during emergencies, or rising countermeasure costs needed to preserve the same performance. A gravity threshold problem does not have to announce itself dramatically. It can accumulate like interest. So the honest summary is narrow. Mars gravity is clearly better for mobility than full microgravity, yet it remains far below the load that built the body, and nobody knows whether it is enough for long-term whole-body stability. Those facts have to be heard together. Optimism without the last clause becomes fantasy. Caution without the first clause misses the real advantage Mars might provide. So the best way to hear 0.38 g is as an unresolved number that would shape almost every other system in the body. It may help bones, muscles, blood pressure control, and fluid distribution compared with transit. It may still leave every one of them below Earth normal support. Mars could be good enough for survival, good enough for competent work, and still not good enough for long-term stability. Bone, muscle, circulation, and the eyes are where this uncertainty becomes most concrete. That uncertainty also explains why Mars medicine cannot rely on one clean forecast. It is entirely possible that some systems would stabilize well enough while others continue to drift. A settlement might keep mobility high while asking for constant exercise. It might reduce headward fluid stress while leaving circulation less forgiving than it is on Earth. It might preserve daily function while slowly narrowing long-term reserve. Partial gravity therefore behaves less like a verdict and more like a question posed to every body system in turn. That is why the unresolved gravity threshold belongs near the center of Mars planning rather than at the edge. If the answer turns out to be encouraging, it changes the viability of long residence. If the answer turns out to be incomplete, then a large share of settlement life becomes countermeasure work layered on top of ordinary survival. The number is small, but the consequences of not understanding it reach through the whole project. Bone is easy to misunderstand because it feels passive. We imagine the skeleton as the hard part that simply holds shape, while the more dynamic tissues do the interesting work. But bone is not a statue hidden under the skin. It is living tissue that keeps remodeling itself according to use. NASA's material on bone and muscle loss in microgravity makes this plain. Weight-bearing bones do not stay unchanged when loading drops. They begin to lose mineral density. The process can be quiet. It can be slow enough to miss in daily life. But over long missions it becomes measurable. That quiet pace is exactly what makes bone such a Mars problem. A settler could be working, walking, lifting, sleeping, and following routines that look successful from the outside, while the structural ledger underneath keeps drifting. On the International Space Station, even with planned exercise, astronauts can lose about 1 to 1.5% of bone mineral density per month in weight-bearing regions. Mars is not the ISS. It would be wrong to transfer that rate directly. But the ISS shows the principle with painful clarity. Bone listens to force, not to optimism. Mars would give bone more force than microgravity gives it. That is the hopeful part. Every step would matter. Standing would matter. Carrying equipment would matter. The skeleton would again receive a downward pull that orbit does not provide. Yet the threshold question returns immediately. Is that pull enough? If the answer is no, even partly no, then a Mars crew could preserve day-to-day function while accumulating a slower weakness over the years. The planet might support activity without supporting full structural maintenance. NASA's ISS countermeasure work shows how much effort may be needed even before full answers arrive. Exercise in space is not a hobby. It is workload assigned to slow decline. Resistance devices, scheduling discipline, nutrition, and recovery all become part of protecting the skeleton. That experience matters for Mars because it strips away a common fantasy. The body does not automatically stay healthy just because people are highly motivated and technically skilled. Bones do not reward mission meaning. They reward the mechanical conditions they evolved to expect. Imagine what that means on a settlement timeline. The first year might look good. People can walk, they can work, they can complete EVAs. Habitat construction continues. Procedures become smoother. Nothing in daily life screams that the skeleton is losing ground. Then the costs begin to matter in a more practical way. Recovery after strain may change. Injury risk may change. The reserve a person carries into an emergency may narrow. Bone that has been underloaded for years is not just weaker in the abstract. It is less forgiving when something goes wrong. The return to earth question shows the same issue from another angle, but the deeper point is about living there, not coming home. A body can remain productive on Mars while becoming less resilient. That is the distinction worth holding on to. Stability matters more than appearance. It matters more than the symbolic victory of walking on another world. Bone loss would not have to be dramatic to reshape what kind of life Mars could support. Even a modest but persistent structural penalty would turn settlement into a constant negotiation between ambition and bodily maintenance. There is also a social cost hidden inside this. If preserving skeletal health requires daily loading, monitoring, and equipment upkeep, then bone health starts claiming habitat volume, power, crew time, and planning attention. A settlement does not simply build bedrooms and labs. It builds the conditions needed to keep the crew's structure from drifting away from Earth standards. That means the skeleton reaches outward into architecture, logistics, and morale. A body system becomes a settlement design requirement. So bone teaches a hard lesson early. Mars does not need to crush the body to change it. It only needs to ask slightly too little of the skeleton for slightly too long. If that happens, the cost can stay nearly invisible until enough time has passed that it is no longer small. That is why bone cannot be judged by whether a settler looks fine in the short term. It has to be judged by whether years of life on Mars leave the body as sturdy as the mission assumed. The answer depends on loading, and the next system makes the same point faster. Muscles tell the truth sooner. NASA's countermeasure work on the station adds one more practical warning. Even in microgravity, where crews know bone loss is a major issue, the answer is not a single pill or one clever machine. It is a package of resistance exercise, nutrition, monitoring, and time spent doing maintenance that has no glamour at all. Mars would inherit that discipline and then complicate it. Settlers would want to spend time on science, construction, repairs, and exploration. Yet some of their day might still have to be reserved for the narrow purpose of reminding the skeleton what a healthy load feels like. If the settlement ever starts skipping that burden because the crew looks busy and capable, the bill may arrive months later in bone quality, rather than in a dramatic immediate crisis. Bone also forces a distinction between productivity and reserve. A person can perform useful work while carrying less structural margin than the mission planners expected. They may look normal in a suit, they may meet every schedule, they may lift tools and climb ladders without trouble. The question is what happens after repeated strain, after a fall, after a wrench slips, or after years of cumulative underloading have quietly reduced the buffer that healthy bone usually provides. Mars settlement would therefore need to care about the skeleton in the same way good builders care about hidden beams. You do not wait for obvious failure. You watch the structure because the whole habitat depends on it. That is why the bone problem reaches beyond medicine and into the politics of time inside a base. Exercise hardware has to be launched, powered, repaired, and defended as essential infrastructure. Monitoring has to continue when crews are tired of being measured. Food systems have to support the same goal, because remodeling tissue depends on inputs as well as force. And every sign of stability has to be read with caution, because Mars may be slowing decline rather than ending it. Bone health on Mars would not be a side note beneath the glory of settlement. It would be part of what settlement is. The same logic reaches into age structure and mission design. A short demonstration stay might never reveal the full skeletal cost. A settlement intended to last for years would have no such luxury. The longer people remain, the more important the hidden curve becomes. Mars can feel successful long before the skeleton has answered whether that success is physiologically durable. That is why bone deserves patience, monitoring, and skepticism, even in a scenario where everything looks stable from the outside. Bone also forces planners to think about what kind of emergencies a settlement can absorb. A body with less skeletal reserve is harder to ask for heavy, unexpected work. It may tolerate a fall less well. It may recover from repetitive strain less smoothly. Those are not abstract concerns in a place where repairs, evacuations, and outside work can all become physically demanding very quickly. The skeleton is therefore part of the settlement's safety margin as much as the habitat wall is. If Mars is quietly borrowing strength from the crew over time, that cost reaches every demanding moment later on. Muscle is a little more honest than bone because the losses can show up sooner in daily life. NASA's descriptions of long-duration spaceflight keep returning to reduced muscle mass, reduced strength, and reduced aerobic capacity in microgravity. The body saves energy when gravity stops demanding as much from it. Muscles that normally work all day to support posture, movement, and heavy effort begin to do less. That change is not mysterious. It is efficient in a bad environment. If the body is not being asked for the same output, it slowly trims the parts that once supplied it. Mars interrupts that process without necessarily ending it. A person on the surface would stand, climb, kneel, turn, and carry tools in a way that transit crews cannot do. Walking on Mars would recruit muscles that microgravity largely lets rest. That is one reason the first surface footage would feel so hopeful. Movement would look like proof that the body had regained something important. And it would have regained something important. The trouble is that visible activity and full maintenance are not the same condition. The Science Advances rat study gives a useful shape to that difference. At about 0.33 g, some muscle atrophy was mitigated. At about 0.67 g, muscle force and bone were preserved more strongly. Mars sits near the lower value, not the higher one. Again, that is not a direct human verdict, but it suggests a world where the body gets partial help rather than full restoration. Mars may slow muscle decline without cancelling it. A crew may work capably while still living below the loading threshold that Earth-trained muscle expects. That possibility changes what exercise means. On Earth, exercise often improves health beyond baseline. On Mars, exercise may be needed just to keep the baseline from sliding away. NASA's countermeasure work in orbit already points toward this. Crews do not train because it is inspirational. They train because the body without those loads drifts in the wrong direction. A Mars settlement could inherit that same logic. The gym would not be a bonus room. It would be part of the same health support system as air processing and water recycling. Think about the burden hidden in that fact. If preserving ordinary physical function requires regular resistance work and careful programming, then crew time becomes a physiological resource. The habitat must carry equipment robust enough to load the body. Power must run it. Maintenance must keep it usable. Nutrition must support recovery. Schedules must protect the training time even when work outside is demanding. Morale must survive the strange feeling of training not for excellence but for defense. The crew may be working hard just to remain average by Earth standards. That changes how daily effort feels. Every EVA, every ladder climb, every carried component, every emergency repair, every long walk back through an airlock draws from a body whose support may already be thinner than it would be on Earth. Fatigue can arrive earlier. Reserve can shrink. A person may still appear strong while paying more for each task than the same task would cost at 1G. The mission then becomes physically expensive in a way that ordinary footage will not show. Mobility stays possible, but it may no longer be cheap. Muscle loss also narrows the margin around everything else. Reduced strength can make awkward movements riskier. Lower aerobic capacity can make emergencies harder to absorb. Slower recovery can turn back-to-back demanding days into a deeper problem. On Earth, we often use the word fitness to mean performance above the minimum. On Mars, the same work may function more like stabilization. The crew is not necessarily trying to become strong, it is trying not to become weak. That is why the sight of people moving on Mars would deserve both celebration and caution. Motion proves possibility. It does not prove long-term sufficiency. A human body can look competent while carrying a hidden tax in muscle reserve. Mars may help compared with orbit and still demand daily countermeasures to keep that tax from growing. If so, the planet would not merely host human movement, it would make the preservation of movement part of the settlement's permanent labor. And once muscles and bones are under negotiation, circulation cannot stay untouched for long. Gravity trains blood too. NASA's ISS work is useful because it shows how quickly the body starts economizing when gravity stops asking enough from it. Postural muscles, leg muscles, and the systems that support sustained effort all respond to demand. Remove demand, and the body trims what it no longer needs. Mars would restore demand part way. A crew member walking across a habitat floor or climbing into a rover would recruit muscle groups that transit crews are not using in the same way. That is real help. Yet, the body does not grade on intention. If the average load remains below the threshold that keeps muscle mass and force stable, the decline may continue more slowly while still continuing. Daily life would make that visible in subtle ways before it became dramatic. Tasks that look simple on paper can become more expensive when reserve is thinner. Carrying a cylinder across an airlock, kneeling for a repair, getting back up in a suit, or walking back from a work site after hours outside may each cost a little more than the same task would cost on Earth. None of those differences has to end a mission to matter. Added together, they shape fatigue, recovery, morale, and the amount of work a crew can do before exercise time and rest begin competing with everything else the mission wants. That is why Mars muscle health is really a story about budgets. Time, calories, equipment wear, and crew motivation all become part of the same problem. Resistance devices need maintenance, training schedules need to survive busy weeks. Food intake has to support repair. Sleep has to support repair too. A crew can feel as if it is living on a solid world and still be spending a large share of its routine protecting the physical capacity that Earth normally maintains in the background. Muscle, like bone, turns Mars into a place where ordinary physical competence has to be actively defended. This matters because muscle is one of the places where false confidence could grow fastest. A crew that walks well and keeps getting work done can look strong enough to everyone watching. Yet Mars may be asking that strength to exist on thinner margins than Earth would. If recovery slows, reserve shrinks, or heavy effort costs more than expected, the settlement begins paying for that gap in scheduling, fatigue, and injury risk. Muscles would therefore become one of the clearest daily indicators of whether the planet is supporting the body or quietly taxing it. NASA's note about reduced aerobic capacity in microgravity makes that point wider than strength alone. Mars settlers would need endurance as much as force. Suit work, repeated climbs, emergency repairs, and long interior workdays all ask the heart, lungs, and muscles to cooperate over time. If partial gravity preserves some of that better than orbit, while still leaving the system below Earth normal demand, the settlement may discover that effort remains possible but costly. Long days could take more out of people than expected. Back-to-back hard days could demand more recovery than schedules first assumed. Muscle health on Mars is therefore also about how much useful work a human body can keep doing before ordinary duty starts resembling chronic overexertion. Gravity does more than hold us to the ground. It teaches the circulation how to work. Every time a person stands up on Earth, blood has to be kept moving to the brain even while the body remains tall and upright. Vessels constrict. Pressure is adjusted. Volume is distributed against a full downward pull. Healthy people rarely notice any of that because the system is so good at hiding its own labor. Spaceflight removes that invisibility. NASA's human body in space material describes reduced blood volume, altered cardiovascular conditioning, and readaptation problems when astronauts return to Earth after long missions. Mars would change the lesson again without restoring the old classroom. Transit to Mars would likely involve months of microgravity, which can reduce plasma volume and alter how the body handles standing and exertion. Arrival on Mars would reintroduce a downward pull, but not the one the body evolved under. The circulation would not merely adapt once, it would adapt from 1 g to microgravity, then to 0.38 g, possibly for years, then back to microgravity for the return, and finally back to 1 g on Earth. A Mars mission would be a chain of cardiovascular relearning that matters because relative improvement can feel more reassuring than it really is. A crew member might stand and walk more easily on Mars than they could in orbit. That would make sense. Some gravity is support, but easier than orbit is not the same as normal. The body may still be living in a narrowed band of pressure regulation. Fatigue after exertion may still arrive sooner. Dehydration may matter more. Heat handling may change. The tolerance for sudden standing, long work periods, or quick recovery after sickness may not have the forgiving margin that Earth builds into healthy circulation. NASA's risk framework is careful here for a reason. Altered gravity is not only a musculoskeletal problem, it changes fluid distribution and the cardiovascular workload that every task quietly depends on. Think about an EVA day on Mars. A person suits up, spends hours working outside, returns through the airlock and then tries to recover for whatever comes next. The body handling that routine is not the same body that handled it on Earth. Its circulation has been taught by months in transit and by life under weaker gravity. It may work well, it may even work impressively, but it is working from a different baseline. That different baseline can become important during stress, not only during ordinary life. Cardiovascular systems often seem fine right up to the point where reserves are suddenly needed. Illness, poor sleep, fluid loss, heavy exertion, a frightening situation. These are the moments that reveal whether the body's regulation stayed broad and resilient or only looked broad while conditions were kind. Mars adds distance and delay to that equation. If a crew member becomes lightheaded, weak, or slow to recover, the body is not being assessed under Earth normal safety nets. It is being assessed locally by a team already living inside a narrow environment. This is why blood cannot be treated as a soft secondary issue after bone and muscle. Circulation is a distribution network for oxygen, nutrients, hormones, immune cells, heat, and waste. If gravity changes how that network expects to operate, then the effects spread widely. Work tolerance changes, recovery changes, the ability to absorb a demanding day changes. The way a body responds to infection or dehydration changes. Even mood and mental sharpness can feel different when exertion and blood pressure regulation are under strain. Mars does not have to break circulation to make circulation matter. There is also a timing problem built into the mission itself. The body might partly readapt during the first weeks on Mars and then face a second plateau. Some changes may improve, others may remain unresolved. Some may become worse only over long stays. Because no human being has lived through the full Earth to transit to Mars to transit to Earth sequence, we do not yet know how stable that cycling is. The crew could look settled while still carrying a long-term penalty in reserve or recovery. That is an uncomfortable kind of uncertainty because it is easy to miss until demands rise. So the honest picture is neither a calm promise that some gravity solves circulation, nor a dramatic claim that Mars leaves crews half collapsed. It is suppler than both. Mars probably supports the cardiovascular system better than orbit does. That is worth saying plainly. But the planet still asks circulation to learn a new rule set and to live by it for years. Whether that new rule set remains strong enough, wide enough, and forgiving enough for long human life is still unmeasured. Blood learns the planet it lives on. On Mars, the lesson might work. It might also stay incomplete, and if fluid distribution remains incomplete, the eyes may be one of the first places to show it. NASA's descriptions of readaptation on return to Earth help explain why this matters. Astronauts can come home with reduced blood volume and trouble tolerating standing because the cardiovascular system has been living in a world with less downward pull. Mars would interrupt that process without necessarily erasing it. The crew would arrive after months of transit with one set of adaptations already in place, then begin another phase on the surface. That sequence matters because physiology often carries memory. The body is not starting fresh on Mars. It is arriving already changed and then being asked to stabilize under a different, still weaker gravity field. Everyday Mars work would keep testing that partial adaptation. Sweat loss during a suit operation, dehydration during a busy day, poor sleep before a repair, or illness that reduces appetite can all matter more when circulation is already operating inside a narrower band. The concern is not that every crew member would be fainting in corridors. The concern is that reserve may be smaller than the behavior on screen suggests. A body can look capable while still being easier to tip into fatigue, slower recovery, or blood pressure instability when conditions stop being ideal. That is exactly the kind of hidden cost a long settlement has to measure carefully. Circulation also links strongly to every other body system because blood is the transport system for almost everything the body is trying to preserve. Oxygen delivery, waste removal, immune traffic, heat handling, exercise tolerance, and mental sharpness all depend on it. If Mars gravity leaves the cardiovascular system partly improved relative to orbit and still partly incomplete relative to Earth, then the crew is living with a system that works and yet may remain less forgiving. That kind of half solution is one of the central patterns in the Mars story. For that reason, circulation may end up telling planners something important about the overall character of settlement. If blood pressure control, recovery, and exertion tolerance remain broad, many other routines become easier. If they remain narrow, almost every demanding day becomes more expensive. Mars does not have to produce dramatic collapse for circulation to shape daily life. It only has to reduce the margin that Earth normally provides for free. This is especially important because circulation is one of the systems most likely to reveal itself during transitions rather than during stillness. Standing up quickly after rest, moving from the habitat into a suit, working through dehydration or recovering from illness can all expose whether the cardiovascular system is operating with plenty of room or with a hidden deficit. Mars settlement would therefore need to treat those small transitions as useful evidence. They are the moments when the body quietly shows whether some gravity has truly rebuilt a robust baseline or only something adequate under kind conditions. Vision gives altered gravity a special kind of force because it moves the problem from hidden physiology into daily experience. A body can tolerate many invisible shifts if it still feels clear and coordinated in the world. But NASA's work on spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome, or SANS, shows that long-duration missions can leave visible marks on the eye and nearby structures. Public NASA material notes that around 70% of ISS astronauts show some swelling at the back of the eye. The details are still being studied, yet the broad message is firm enough. Gravity changes can leave a record in sight itself. The leading picture behind that risk is headward fluid shift. On Earth, gravity keeps a steady downward tug on blood and other fluids. Remove enough of that tug and fluids redistribute. NASA's OCMO brief on SANS explains that the long-duration space environment appears to alter pressures and structures in ways that can affect the eye. That makes the problem mechanical before it is dramatic. The body is not being punished by some mysterious space force. It is responding to a different pattern of fluid loading than the one it evolved to handle. Mars may help with that. It would be strange if it did not help at all. A partial downward pull ought to change the fluid picture compared with full microgravity. But the same rule keeps returning. Help is not proof of sufficiency. We do not yet know whether 0.38 G is enough to normalize the long-term pressure environment around the eye. The evidence base simply does not exist yet, so Mars could reduce risk while still leaving a residual one. That is exactly the kind of mixed answer that the body keeps pushing us toward. This matters because the eyes are woven into nearly every mission task. Reading procedures, monitoring suit readouts, judging distance while walking on rough ground, handling tools, responding to alarms, navigating airlocks, watching the condition of another crew member. Vision is not a luxury system that can drift a little without consequence. It is one of the main channels by which people operate safely. If Mars leaves even a modest, long-term uncertainty around fluid shift and ocular stability, then the crew may need monitoring, mitigation, and caution long after the first landing triumph is over. The eye also teaches a useful philosophical lesson about settlement. People often imagine gravity as one number with one meaning. Either there is enough to pin you down or there is not. But body systems do not ask such simple questions. The same partial gravity that feels substantial to the legs may still be incomplete for fluid regulation around the head. A planet can seem physically solid and still be physiologically intermediate. Mars may feel more natural than orbit while still leaving some systems in unresolved territory. That is why the surface can look reassuring while science remains careful. NASA's caution around SANS is worth copying in tone. The agency does not speak as if every astronaut will lose useful vision. It also does not speak as if the issue is trivial. That middle ground is where the Mars discussion should stay. Eye changes are a real long-duration concern. The mechanism likely involves altered fluid distribution. Partial gravity may improve the picture without settling it. Those are the facts that matter. Once they are combined, the conclusion is not melodrama, it is humility. And humility matters on Mars because eye changes would not appear in isolation. Fluids, circulation, and gravity are already tied to each other. If one system remains partly unsettled, the next question is what else is living inside that same unsettled state. The answer leads outward into a different kind of burden altogether. Bone, muscle, blood, and the eyes all respond to altered loading from within the body. Radiation arrives from outside, invisible and persistent, and it never fully stops being part of the environment, so the eye becomes a warning light for the broader mission. A changed fluid pattern can leave traces where precision matters most. Mars might soften that pattern, but whether it softens it enough is still unknown. That is what makes SANS so useful for the larger story. It shows how a planet can seem close to normal while still keeping the body one step away from normal underneath. And once the body is already negotiating altered loading, chronic radiation becomes harder to dismiss as a distant statistical issue. It becomes part of the same ongoing argument over what counts as a stable human environment. NASA's public note that about 70% of astronauts on the ISS show some swelling at the back of the eye is worth sitting with for a moment because it changes the emotional scale of the issue. This is not a weird one-off curiosity. It is evidence that long missions can leave visible marks in a system we rely on constantly. Mars may well reduce that burden compared with orbit. The unresolved part is whether it reduces it enough for multi-year residence. That uncertainty has operational weight because reading instruments, seeing terrain clearly, judging distance, and noticing subtle changes in another person's condition are woven through every mission day. A Mars settlement would likely respond by making eye health part of ordinary monitoring rather than waiting for obvious complaints. The crew might track visual changes, use local imaging tools, and compare small shifts over time. That is a reasonable response to uncertainty. Yet it also reveals how different life on Mars would be from life on Earth. On Earth, most people assume their surrounding gravity is already doing the quiet work needed to keep fluid distributions within a human range. On Mars, the crew may have to keep asking whether the planet is doing enough. The eyes also remind us that a surface can feel familiar before the body agrees. A person can walk in a straight line under a sky and still have unresolved fluid mechanics around the head. That mismatch between appearance and physiology is one of the reasons Mars is so scientifically rich and so medically difficult. It looks like a place where human life might settle. It may be that place. The body still demands evidence system by system before it gives the same answer. Eye health also illustrates how much Mars would depend on early detection rather than late rescue. Vision changes are easier to manage when they are noticed early, measured carefully, and interpreted in the context of fluid shifts and long mission duration. They become harder when the crew waits for obvious decline. That means monitoring tools, comparison records, and local diagnostic skill become part of settlement maturity. A planet that leaves even small uncertainty around vision pushes the crew toward more careful self-observation than most people ever need on Earth. In that sense, the eye becomes a practical test of how honest a settlement is being with itself. If the crew keeps watching carefully and sees stability, confidence grows for good reason. If small shifts keep appearing, Mars is offering a warning before larger failures arrive elsewhere. Vision therefore matters as a safety issue in its own right, and as a signal about whether partial gravity is truly supporting the body well enough. That is one reason eye changes would command attention out of proportion to their size. They turn an invisible fluid problem into something the crew can measure and compare over time. Few body systems provide such a clear window into whether the new environment is really becoming normal. Radiation is one of the easiest Mars hazards to miss here. The mind jumps either to a single cinematic burst or to a remote cancer risk that belongs mostly to old age. NASA's Mars and human spaceflight material points toward a different picture. Radiation on and around Mars is both persistent and cumulative. Galactic cosmic rays form a constant background. Solar particle events add episodic spikes. Curiosity's Radiation Assessment Detector, or RAD, gave NASA and JPL the first direct measurements of the radiation environment at the Martian surface. The point of those measurements was not to turn Mars into instant doom theater. It was to quantify an environment crews would live inside. That living inside part is what changes the story. A Mars crew would not face radiation only during one exposed emergency. They would carry it through the calendar. Habitat design, EVA timing, work location, refuge planning, and total mission duration all start to matter, because dose is accumulated, not merely encountered. NASA's Human Health and Performance document treats space radiation as a system-level concern, precisely because it reaches beyond one future illness. It shapes how long people can stay, where they can work, and what trade-offs they accept during the mission. Mars does offer some help compared with open space. Its atmosphere, thin as it is, provides some moderation, and local terrain can matter too. That is why NASA's public material about radiation on Mars is more measured than a lot of popular talk. The surface is not equivalent to deep space transit, but neither is it remotely Earth-like. The planet has no global magnetic field today, and its atmosphere is far thinner than ours. So the radiation story is neither total exposure nor solved shelter. It is a reduced burden that remains a burden. The health consequences are often described conservatively because they should be. NASA and major review papers point to cancer risk, central nervous system concern, cardiovascular concern, and uncertainty around other tissue effects at high cumulative exposure. For a Mars documentary, the exact menu matters less than the broader point. Radiation is not just a late statistical footnote after the mission is over. It is a steady organ-level stress that mission planners must keep accounting for while the mission is still underway. The body cannot feel most of it directly, which makes careful planning even more important. A useful way to picture this is as invisible weather that never fully clears. The crew wakes up inside it, works inside it, sleeps inside it, and goes outside knowing it is still there. That does not mean people would be helpless. It means the environment keeps asking for management. Storm shelters matter. Surface routines matter. Total time on the planet matters. The difference between one site and another may matter. Radiation becomes less like one enemy and more like a pressure that keeps narrowing the margin around every other decision. It also refuses to stay alone. A person already living in lower gravity, inside a closed habitat, far from quick medical support, dealing with dust and with the strain of long missions, does not experience radiation as a neat separate category. The body carries cumulative exposure while also trying to preserve muscle, manage sleep, maintain immunity, and stay operational under delayed care. NASA's 5-hazard framework is helpful here because it stops us from speaking as if the body receives one burden at a time. Mars asks the same body to absorb several chronic pressures together. That coupling changes how radiation should be heard in the daily life sense. Higher cumulative exposure can influence where the crew shelters and how often it accepts outside work. Those operational choices can then affect exercise, fatigue, stress, and even the amount of dust coming indoors on repeated EVAs. Radiation is not only a medical quantity, it is a force shaping the geography of the settlement and the rhythm of ordinary life. A planet that keeps adding invisible burden will eventually influence where human beings choose to stand, sleep, and spend time. So the right tone is neither panic nor dismissal. Mars does not need to become a death sentence for radiation to remain a serious human health problem. The more mature reading is that chronic exposure becomes part of the body's long negotiation with the planet. NASA and JPL measurements let us speak about that pressure with real numbers and real limits rather than fantasy. And once chronic exposure is understood as a managed but unresolved part of life, the next question becomes more practical. If terrain and local shielding can reduce some of that burden, how much relief can Mars actually offer before the rest of the physiology story reasserts itself? The JPL work around curiosity matters, because it moved the topic from abstract warning to measured environment. Crews would not be guessing whether Mars radiation exists. They would be planning around a quantified background that varies with solar conditions, location, and local cover. That turns radiation into a design pressure that touches habitat siting, EVA limits, storm shelters, and the simple question of where a person spends most of each day. On Earth, people do not usually choose a bedroom partly because of shielding mass above it. On Mars, that could be an ordinary part of settlement logic. Radiation also changes how the mission hears time. A short stay and a long residence are not the same biological proposition because dose accumulates. Transit dose and surface dose belong to the same body. The crew does not reset to zero after landing. That matters when discussing lifetime risk, but it also matters psychologically during the mission. The environment outside the wall is asking for ongoing restraint. Hours outside become part of a budget. So does the choice between a convenient site and a better protected one. Radiation is therefore a chronic organ stress and a chronic planning stress at the same time. This is one reason Mars cannot be reduced to a single hopeful improvement such as partial gravity. Better mobility and more solid footing do not erase the fact that the body is also living under persistent ionizing exposure. A crew may feel more human on the surface than in transit, and still be carrying a cumulative burden that reaches cells and tissues they cannot sense directly. That mismatch between lived experience and hidden dose is part of what makes Mars serious. The planet can feel workable while still charging the body in invisible ways. Radiation, therefore, becomes one of the clearest examples of the difference between livable and forgiving. A place can be livable if the crew can manage dose well enough to keep the mission going. It becomes forgiving only if mistakes, delays, and long residence stop carrying such persistent biological cost. Mars does not yet offer that second condition. The body would feel the difference even if the crew never had a cinematic emergency. That is also why radiation belongs in the same sentence as morale and planning discipline. Invisible risk is easy to underestimate when the crew feels competent and daily life seems steady. A base that has gone months without trouble may still be accumulating biological cost in the background. Mars therefore rewards habits that look conservative from the outside. Strong shelters, careful site choice, and restraint about exposure are not signs of fear. They are signs that the settlement understands what the planet is asking the body to absorb. That discipline may feel tedious during good periods. It becomes easier to defend once the crew remembers that Mars never stops being itself merely because the workday went smoothly. Radiation is part of the environment every hour, whether anyone can feel it or not. One of the most hopeful Mars findings in recent years came from a very ordinary piece of geography. NASA and JPL reported that Curiosity's RAD instrument measured lower radiation when the rover was parked beside a cliff. The published result was modest, about a 4% drop in overall radiation and a larger drop in neutral particle radiation. Yet it mattered because it turned shielding from abstraction into place. Terrain can help, local structure can change exposure enough to measure. A wall of rock is not a slogan, it is matter between the body and part of the radiation environment. That means settlement siting on Mars would not be only about flat land, sunlight and engineering convenience. It would also be about where the planet itself can take some of the burden back. Once that becomes clear, the architecture discussion starts sounding much less speculative. People talk about piling regolith over habitats, cutting living spaces into natural depressions, or using overhangs and lava tubes because each option adds mass between the crew and the sky. Chronic radiation makes that mass medically useful. NASA's public material treats the instinct seriously for exactly that reason. More cover does not solve everything, but it can cut exposure in a way the body can cash in. The trouble begins when that useful idea gets promoted into a cure. Burying a habitat can lower dose, but it does not restore 1G, a rich open ecology, nearby hospitals, or the protection of a global magnetic field. It also does nothing to erase the radiation already absorbed in transit, and it cannot protect the crew during every hour spent outside the refuge. A smarter site reduces one burden inside the same hostile world. It does not end the world that created the burden. JPL's cliff result is valuable precisely because it forces that scale back into view. The rover saw a measurable reduction, which means geography belongs in the design conversation from the start. Settlement planners would map shielding potential the same way they map landing risk or construction difficulty, because a better location can buy a real biological margin. Yet the number was a reduction, not a disappearance. Radiation beside the cliff was lower, and that is all. On Mars, that kind of partial help is often the honest form of good news. That changes daily life. The best protected sleeping area becomes more than a comfortable room. It becomes the place where the crew banks less dose during the longest part of the day. Routes for ordinary surface work start to matter because distance from shelter now translates into time lived under worse cover. Emergency plans change too, since a solar event is not only a scheduling interruption, but a race back toward mass. Radiation protection begins shaping the layout of ours as much as the layout of walls. Even so, the larger ledger remains. A crew could sleep under heavy cover and still wake up in lower gravity, carry dust back from surface work, and rely on a closed habitat where diagnosis and treatment stay local for too long. Shielding can slow one stream of damage without fixing the rest of the biology problem. That is why Mars resists simple victory laps. The system keeps asking more than one thing from the body at a time. That is why shielding deserves respect rather than worship. Respect means taking measured reductions seriously, using terrain intelligently, and building habitats that soften the radiation burden as much as mission constraints allow. Worship would mean talking as if local cover answers the full human question. It does not. It answers a piece of the question, and on Mars pieces matter enormously. But the body is keeping more than one account at once. Better shelter can change the feasibility of long stays without proving that long stays remain healthy. The most useful conclusion is a quiet one. Mars itself can help protect life if people learn to settle in the right places and hide under enough mass. That is good news. It may be mission-changing news. It is not body-fixing news. The planet can offer safer pockets inside an environment that still remains fundamentally different from Earth. Once that is clear, the next leak in the story appears almost immediately. Even if the crew learns how to hide from some of the radiation, one of Mars's most ordinary materials still insists on following them home. Dust keeps crossing the doorway. What makes the cliff result so important is not the size of the reduction by itself. it is the change in design logic that follows from it. Shielding stops being a general hope and becomes a geographic resource that can be mapped, compared, and traded against other needs. A site with stronger natural cover may be worth a harder construction schedule. A sleeping area under more mass may be worth a longer walk to another work zone. Emergency shelters become part of how the base is laid out, not an afterthought added late. Once radiation is understood that way, the map of a Mars settlement begins to look different from the map of an Earth outpost. That map would also divide time differently. Sleep, maintenance, and high-value, long-duration tasks would likely cluster where shielding is strongest. Quick surface sorties might be acceptable farther out. Large construction jobs may need their own protection plans simply because crews would spend long stretches away from the best cover. Even the route between two buildings might matter if repeated exposure accumulates over thousands of crossings. Radiation protection in that sense becomes choreography. It shapes where bodies spend their hours, not only what walls are built around them. There is another limit worth stating clearly. A shielded habitat is still Mars housing. Its air and water remain closed loops, its floor still pulls at 0.38 G, and its crew still lives with dust, soil chemistry, and delayed medical help. Local shielding is valuable because it widens the margin elsewhere. What it cannot do is turn the settlement into a biological equivalent of Earth. Mars keeps every improvement inside that larger boundary. Shielding can even create new trade-offs. A heavily buried habitat or lava tube may cut dose while making construction, evacuation, lighting, or day-to-day movement harder. That is not a reason to dismiss the idea. It is a reminder that Mars rarely hands out a free solution. One better answer usually arrives with another design problem attached, and bodies have to live with both. That is part of what makes shielding such a good summary of the whole Mars problem. The right answer is almost never a perfect answer. It is a better compromise. More rock overhead helps, yet it does not bring back 1G, rich ecology, or quick medical rescue. Mars keeps rewarding improvements while refusing to turn those improvements into completeness. The body would live inside that pattern every day. Settlement optimism therefore has to stay quantitative. A few % less dose is worth having. Better refuge geometry is worth having. A site with more natural cover is worth having. Mars simply does not let any of those gains pretend to be the whole answer. Dust on Mars is easy to reduce to scenery. We picture red storms, hazy horizons, rover tracks and boots leaving soft marks behind. NASA's Mars Facts page and Earth Observatory material describe a world where dust is common, mobile, and deeply tied to the planet's appearance. But the visual beauty of Martian dust hides a more practical truth. Dust is one of the main ways Mars keeps entering the habitat after the crew thinks the outside world has been left behind. Martian dust behaves differently from the sort of dirt people are used to forgiving on Earth. Fine particles can stay suspended more easily in the thin atmosphere and lower gravity. They can move through work sites and keep settling where crews do not want them. Once a person has spent hours outside, the issue is no longer what the landscape looked like from a distance. It is what came back on the suit, on gloves, around joints, at seals, across the floor, and into the equipment that has to keep the habitat functioning. Dust becomes a transfer mechanism between the surface and the body. NASA-supported EVA risk literature treats that transfer seriously because it is not only a housekeeping problem. Fine, abrasive particles can wear equipment, challenge seals, burden filters, and increase contamination control work. Toxicology studies using Martian dust simulants add another caution. They do not prove exact clinical outcomes for future settlers, but they do support concern that repeated inhalation exposure could matter. The proper boundary is important here. We are not saying Mars dust is known to cause a specific disease pattern in settlers who do not yet exist. We are saying the available evidence is strong enough to make repeated exposure and repeated intrusion a real body problem. The repeated part may be the most important. One dusty EVA is a chore. Thousands of dusty crossings over months and years create a living condition. Airlocks need more attention, filters do more work. Surfaces demand stricter cleaning. Suit procedures become slower and more careful. The internal environment never fully relaxes into the simple category of indoors because the planet keeps trying to accompany the crew in powdered form. That turns ordinary routines into long-term physiological defense. The body enters this story through several doors at once. Irritated airways matter. Eyes matter. Skin matters. The burden of breathing air that passes through more filters and more contamination worries matters. So does the indirect effect on workload and stress. A planet that keeps coating the threshold asks the crew to spend part of its life fighting intrusion. Time and attention are being diverted into preserving the line between outside and inside. That is a biological issue even before a doctor would label it one. Dust also exposes the weakness of the idea that habitat life and surface life can be kept neatly separate. They cannot. Surface conditions keep shaping the internal world through what workers carry back, what equipment sheds, and what air handling systems must catch. The habitat becomes a zone of continual cleanup, and that cleanup is in service of lungs, eyes, skin, and basic environmental quality, not only aesthetics. Mars dust therefore links planetary geology directly to daily human physiology. This is where the Mars documentary starts feeling less like a list of dangers and more like a single connected environment pressing on a body from several angles at once. Lower gravity may already be changing muscle, bone, and circulation. Radiation may already be shaping where people shelter. Then dust adds a repeated mechanical intrusion that keeps testing the border of the habitat. The question is no longer whether one hazard is survivable. It is what kind of life accumulates when all of these pressures arrive in ordinary routines. And dust is only the mechanical route indoors. The chemistry tied to the soil can matter too. NASA's work on perchlorates gives that next layer its proper weight. The body does not only have to worry about particles crossing the threshold, it has to worry about what local material contains once it enters the loops that keep people alive. NASA's Earth Observatory explanation of Martian dust helps clarify why this is such a stubborn problem. Dust stays aloft differently there because the atmosphere is thin and gravity is weaker. A particle that would settle quickly on Earth can remain part of the moving environment for longer. That means a work site may keep reloading suits and seals with fine material even after the obvious storm or plume has passed. Mars does not have to be in cinematic chaos for dust to matter. Ordinary days are enough. Toxicology work with Martian dust simulants adds another layer of caution because it focuses attention on the lungs rather than on scenery. The existing studies do not let us narrate a precise disease outcome for settlers. That would go too far. What they do justify is serious concern about repeated exposure to fine reactive material over long periods. The body does not experience that as one dramatic event. It experiences it as irritation, filtration burden, cleaning burden, and the slow cost of living where the threshold between outside and inside is always under attack. Dust also has a way of increasing the price of every other protective system. Filters wear faster. Seals need more care. Cleaning consumes crew time. Surface operations become slower because contamination control is never fully optional. That means dust reaches the body directly through exposure and indirectly through workload, stress, and equipment strain. Mars is teaching the same lesson again. A planet does not have to strike the body once to be dangerous. It can keep pressing on the same humans through repetitive ordinary maintenance. That repetitive nature is what would make dust feel so different from a storm on Earth. A storm passes and then a city returns to a familiar baseline. Mars dust would remain part of the normal relationship between habitat and surface. Suits, locks, floors, vents, tools, and filters would all be places where the outside world tries to continue the conversation indoors. Over years of residence, that constant abrasion and intrusion could become one of the most exhausting features of settlement life, precisely because it is never spectacular enough to stop anything outright. It simply keeps asking for labor. That labor matters because it quietly competes with everything else a settlement wants to do. Time spent cleaning suits, checking seals, replacing filters, and managing contaminated surfaces is time not spent on science, construction, or rest. Mars dust therefore taxes the crew twice. It creates a possible exposure route, and it consumes attention that healthy bodies would rather spend elsewhere. The result is a world where even housekeeping becomes part of mission medicine. The longer the settlement lasts, the more this may shape culture as much as engineering. Crews may become obsessed with thresholds, suit discipline, and cleanliness because they learn through experience that every neglected surface lets the outside world creep farther inward. Dust would become one of the daily teachers of respect on Mars. That cultural effect matters because routines are one of the main ways humans defend themselves against chronic environments. A Mars base that treats dust casually would slowly hand the planet more access to lungs, eyes, equipment, and attention. A Mars base that treats dust seriously may feel stricter and slower, but it would also be telling the truth about the environment. Repetition would become the price of staying ahead of a world made of fine abrasive powder. Dust therefore becomes a good example of what long-term adaptation on Mars would probably look like. Not dramatic transformation, discipline. The body stays safer because the crew keeps doing small protective things well every day for years. That is useful and demanding at the same time. Water on Mars often sounds like rescue. Find ice, melt it, process it, drink it, grow with it, split it into useful gases, and the settlement picture immediately becomes more practical. That instinct is understandable because water is life support in one word. But NASA's Detoxifying Mars work highlights an awkward detail that changes the tone of the whole conversation. Martian environments can involve perchlorates, a group of chemicals that turn local resource use into a purification problem as well as an opportunity. That matters because local materials on Mars are never just there in the abstract. They are there in the same closed loops that support the body. Water intended for drinking, hygiene, agriculture, or oxygen generation has to be clean enough for human use. Regolith used in processing or habitat operations can introduce chemistry the crew does not want circulating through air, surfaces, or internal systems. NASA's perchlorate research therefore does something subtle but important. It moves the conversation away from treasure hunt language and toward bodily consequence. The key boundary is to stay exact. Perchlorates are not a magic doom substance that makes Mars automatically uninhabitable, but they are also not a footnote that can be waved away once engineers say they have a plan. A plan is not a settled condition. Detoxification, filtering, and process control all become part of ordinary survival if local water and soil come with chemical baggage attached. The body then depends not just on finding resources, but on stripping those resources back to something compatible with human biology. That is why in situ resource use becomes a body question. The popular picture of ISRU is triumphant engineering, making fuel, extracting water, building up a local economy of life support. All of that may be true, yet every loop that brings Martian material inside the settlement also widens the interface between human biology and Martian geochemistry. The crew is not only harvesting a resource, it is negotiating with contaminants. Water treatment becomes more than logistics. It becomes part of protecting thyroid function, metabolic stability, and the general chemical safety of daily life. The contamination story does not stay inside pipes. It crosses surfaces, tools, filters, and handling routines. Dust brings the mechanical route. Perchlorates reveal the chemical one. A crew member working with locally derived materials is not only doing productive labor, they are participating in the settlement's purification burden. If the detox steps fail or drift, the consequence is not merely lower efficiency, it can be degraded air quality, degraded water quality, or chronic low-level exposure risk moving closer to the body. NASA's own framing on perchlorates is useful because it stays practical. The issue is that Martian water and related resources may come contaminated, so the mission must know how to remove or neutralize the problem. That is a sober sentence, and it carries a lot of weight. It means that local abundance does not equal biological readiness. It means that a settlement can become more self-sufficient in one sense, while becoming more dependent on purification in another. Mars can hand you the raw material and still refuse to make it human. This also shows why the line between engineering and medicine keeps failing on Mars. A purification unit is part of habitat infrastructure, but it is also part of body protection. A chemistry problem in the resource loop becomes a health problem if it crosses into what the crew breathes, drinks, grows, or touches repeatedly. Perchlorates therefore belong in the same physiological story as pressure, dust, and closed habitats. Mars keeps making the support systems do jobs that Earth does naturally. Once local materials are flowing through the settlement, the habitat stops being a sealed shell around people and starts looking more like a living exchange zone between a crew and a very non-human planet. That pushes the story toward a broader ecological question. Even if pressure is maintained, dust is filtered, and water is purified, the people inside are still changing the biology of the habitat and being changed by it in return. NASA's detoxifying Mars work is useful precisely because it does not pretend the chemistry challenge is trivial. Perchlorates are potent oxidizers. NASA describes them as corrosive to equipment and hazardous to human health even at low concentrations. That means the problem belongs to infrastructure and biology at once. A contaminant that degrades machinery is already serious on a distant planet. A contaminant that also threatens the chemistry of drinking water, food growth, or repeated human contact becomes part of the health architecture of the settlement. This shifts the emotional meaning of resource use. The discovery of ice is still good news. Local water still matters enormously. But the phrase "use local resources" now has a second half attached to it. Clean them, test them, clean them again. Watch the process that cleaned them. A settlement that becomes more self-sufficient in water or oxygen production may also become more dependent on purification performance. That is the Mars pattern again. Independence from Earth can increase dependence on local process control. Perchlorates also make daily handling more intimate than the broad engineering diagrams suggest. The crew touches tools, filters, containers, growth systems, and work surfaces. Those are the places where chemistry stops being an abstract property of Martian soil and becomes part of ordinary life. If detoxification works well, that labor becomes invisible. If it drifts, the consequences move toward bodies through repeated contact and shared loops. So perchlorates are not only a chemistry section in the narrow sense, they are one more reason the habitat itself becomes part of human physiology. This is also why Mars resources cannot be evaluated only by abundance. A rich ice deposit is medically useful only after it becomes water clean enough for lungs, skin, digestion, agriculture, and process chemistry. Soil is operationally useful only after the crew understands what comes with it. Local material on Mars therefore arrives with a question attached. Can this be made compatible with the body at the scale daily life requires? That question turns resource extraction into a long-term health discipline rather than a simple engineering victory. The same question would follow every attempt to close the settlement loop more tightly. Growing food locally, reclaiming more water, or expanding chemical processing all sound like signs of maturity, and they are. They also increase the amount of Martian material and Martian chemistry that the base is trying to domesticate safely. Success on Mars may therefore look like increasing capability paired with increasing purification discipline. The body benefits only if both grow together. That pairing matters because self-sufficiency can sound healthier than it really is. A base may produce more of its own essentials, while also asking more from detox systems, filters, and monitoring. Mars turns abundance into health only after compatibility has been earned. The same caution applies to confidence. Once a process has worked for months, people naturally begin to trust it. On Mars, that trust has to remain conditional. Perchlorate handling is safe only while the chemistry, filtration, and testing remain safe. A settlement may therefore need habits that feel almost ceremonial in their repetition, because repetition is what keeps a useful resource from quietly becoming a chronic exposure route. That is a hard lesson for frontier stories, because frontiers are usually framed as places where local abundance means freedom. Mars does not offer that cleanly. Local abundance often arrives with a purification burden attached. The crew gains independence only by accepting more responsibility for chemistry that Earth usually manages on planetary scale. It is tempting to imagine a Mars habitat as a clean machine with people inside it. The walls hold pressure, the systems run, the environment stays stable. Biology is limited to the human bodies using the equipment. NASA's work on host microorganism interactions and the twin study pushes against that image. Human beings do not arrive alone. They bring microbial communities on their skin, in their guts, and on the objects they use. Those communities can change in space. The habitat then becomes not only a mechanical shelter, but a living ecology under artificial constraints. NASA's twin study results and related material help set the tone here. The study looked at one astronaut in space and one on Earth and found a range of changes that included immune, gene expression, and microbiome shifts. It is not a universal script for every future crew member. It is also not trivial. The lesson is that long-duration spaceflight can alter more than one biological layer at once. The body does not merely travel. It changes internally while living in an environment unlike any ordinary Earth habitat. NASA's host microorganism risk pages make the same point in a broader operational way. Microbes do not disappear because a habitat is sealed. They circulate within it. Astronauts leave a microbial fingerprint on the International Space Station, as NASA has noted publicly. That phrase matters because it captures the real direction of travel. A settlement is not a sterile box keeping biology out. It is a small living system shaped by the biology of the people inside it, and by the limits of airflow, humidity, cleaning routines, materials, and closed-loop life support. For the body, that means health is no longer only about one person's organs. Digestion, skin health, infection risk, inflammation, and general resilience may all be affected by changes in the internal ecosystem. The proper caution remains in place. Microbiome change does not automatically equal disease. NASA does not claim that it does. But once crew biology and habitat biology are interacting continuously, the quality of that interaction starts to matter. The question becomes what kind of microbial environment the settlement is building by living in it. Mars deepens that question because the habitat is already under other forms of strain. Dust wants to enter, water has to be processed carefully, exercise equipment may be preserving muscle and bone, radiation may be influencing where people spend time. The people themselves are living under altered gravity and long mission stress. Microbes are therefore not drifting inside a calm, normal building. They are drifting inside a tightly managed environment where every other system is also being forced away from its Earth baseline. That makes ecology a mission issue, not a curiosity. A good image here is not a laboratory dish. It is a small weather system that the crew carries with it. People shed microbes, surfaces hold them, air systems move them, cleaning routines push back, food preparation interacts with them. Stress and physiology may change which communities thrive. Over time, the crew is living inside a biological world that it keeps making and remaking. The habitat is not alive in the human sense, but it is biologically active enough that no serious Mars health discussion can treat it as neutral background. This matters for one more reason. The closer the habitat moves toward a closed ecological loop, the more the line between person and environment blurs. A changed gut microbiome is not only inside one body if the surrounding system is also changing. A skin microbe on a surface is not just a surface story if that surface belongs to a sealed community where everyone shares air and tools. Mars settlement therefore becomes host plus habitat. The body question widens outward again. Once that widening happens, immune function and stress can no longer be treated as softer side categories. They are tied into the same loop. A crew under chronic workload, radiation concern, altered sleep, closed ecology and medical distance is not simply managing separate medical boxes. It is managing a feedback system in which one strain can lean on several others at once. NASA's microbial fingerprint work on the ISS is especially helpful because it makes the habitat feel less like a sealed appliance and more like a lived-in biological place. Astronauts leave traces of themselves in the stations they occupy. Surfaces, air paths, tools, and routines all become part of that shared microbial record. Mars would deepen that pattern because the crew could be living in the same enclosed settlement for years, while also working dust and local materials into the system around them. Ecology would no longer be the backdrop. It would be one of the things the crew is actively building. That matters for the body because digestion, skin barrier health, inflammation, and infection risk are all influenced by the environment organisms live in. The careful boundary remains important. A changed microbiome does not automatically mean disease, yet a closed habitat means the crew has fewer outside buffers and fewer ecological resets than people usually enjoy on Earth. The biological atmosphere inside the base could therefore become another slow variable that shapes resilience over time. This is also where Mars starts to look less like a destination and more like a long cohabitation between people and an artificial ecosystem they cannot fully step away from. They breathe in it, sleep in it, exercise in it, clean it, and alter it simply by living. The more closed the loop becomes, the more the crew's own biology contributes to the environment that later feeds back into the crew. That reciprocity is one of the quietest and most important ways Mars could change the human body. The ecological point also matters, because closed systems can drift slowly before anyone agrees on what the drift means. A change in surface cleaning, humidity control, food preparation, material wear, or crew health may nudge the habitat biology in one direction and then another. None of that guarantees harm. Yet it does mean the settlement cannot assume that a sealed environment will remain biologically neutral simply because the instruments say the pressure and temperature are fine. Human health on Mars would live inside chemistry, mechanics, and ecology at the same time. That is one more reason why a Mars habitat would require a kind of patience that many engineering stories ignore. Some of the most important changes might not appear as alarms. They might appear as trends, a shift in microbial balance, a small change in irritation patterns, a difference in how surfaces behave, or a slow change in crew resilience can all matter before anyone is tempted to call them an emergency. The biology of the habitat would therefore need the same watchfulness that crews already give to pressure and power. In that sense, a biologically healthy habitat would be something the crew tends rather than something it simply inhabits. People would be living inside a managed ecosystem whose condition keeps feeding back into their own condition. That makes habitat ecology one of the clearest examples of how Mars changes the scale of responsibility. On Earth, most people rely on huge biological and environmental buffers they never see. On Mars, a small crew may have to become aware of those buffers precisely because it is trying to replace them in miniature. The habitat would be an environment, not just a shelter, and the body would keep responding to the quality of that environment, whether the crew noticed every change or not. That awareness may become one of the strangest parts of ordinary life on Mars. People would not only clean rooms and repair hardware, they would also be caretakers of the small biological world forming around them. The better they understand that world, the better chance the body has of remaining resilient inside it. That is one more reason Mars should resist the language of simple indoors. Indoors on Earth usually means separation from the wider environment. Indoors on Mars would mean participation in a smaller environment that has to be constantly watched, cleaned, and interpreted. The walls would provide pressure, but they would not cancel ecology, they would concentrate it. And because the crew itself would be one of the main sources shaping that ecology, ordinary acts inside the base would keep changing the environment the body later had to live within. Breathing, cleaning, and bringing dust back through an airlock would leave traces in the same small system the crew depended on. That is what makes Mars indoors different from Earth indoors. The walls would hold a managed environment that keeps responding to the bodies inside it, so every breath, surface walk, and cleanup cycle would feed the same loop. The crew would be living inside a small ecology their own routines help shape and carry forward. People often hear the words stress or immunity and rank them below the harder sounding hazards. Radiation sounds serious, pressure sounds serious, bone loss sounds serious, stress can sound vague, and immunity can sound like a background variable until someone gets sick. NASA's Human Health and Performance Framework pushes against that ranking by treating the hazards as interacting pressures on the same crew. Once that approach is taken seriously, immune function and stress stop looking secondary. They look like multipliers that can change the medical meaning of everything else. NASA's host microorganism material and the twin study offer part of the evidence. Long-duration spaceflight can alter immune-related patterns and microbiome patterns at the same time. Again, caution matters. This does not mean every Mars crew is doomed to immune collapse or strange infections. It means the biological systems that help the body manage infection, inflammation, and recovery are part of the same altered environment as gravity, radiation, confinement, and closed habitat ecology. The body on Mars would not be responding from a calm Earth baseline. It would be responding from a shifted one. Stress sharpens that point because on Mars it would be built into the job. It is the mental effort of staying vigilant, the physical effort of working inside a harsh environment, the erosion of recovery when privacy is thin, and the knowledge that serious help remains far away. NASA's isolation, confinement, and distance from Earth material keeps returning to autonomy for that reason. Autonomy is not only a management idea, it is the condition of making consequential decisions while tired and without quick rescue. Once you see it that way, immune function and stress stop separating cleanly. A crew that sleeps poorly, works through chronic vigilance, and lives inside a sealed habitat is asking the same body to heal wounds, interpret exposures, and recover from ordinary strain. Radiation and altered gravity add pressure to that same organism rather than creating some separate category of risk. None of this needs catastrophe to matter. It simply narrows the distance between a routine symptom and a difficult one. The daily life meaning of this is more important than the dramatic one. Imagine a crew that is competent, trained, and functioning well. They are not panicking, they are not disintegrating. Yet over many months they are sleeping in a sealed habitat, working under altered gravity, tracking dose, filtering dust, managing local resources carefully, and absorbing the mental weight of long communication delays. That crew may still be paying an immune and stress cost for doing everything right. Mars does not need melodrama to make the burden real. The twin study is useful here because it showed that long missions can shift several biological layers at once without producing one neat storyline. Gene expression changed, immune markers moved, microbial patterns moved with them. Some findings reversed after return, while others mainly raised new questions. That mix is the point. A long mission does not press on one button. It keeps adjusting the whole organism, and Mars would add local gravity, surface work, dust, and delayed care on top of that moving baseline. That makes stress operational rather than decorative. It changes how carefully people think, how well they recover, and how much uncertainty a crew can absorb before small exposures start to feel larger. Immune changes matter for the same reason. A body that stays manageable in calm conditions may become harder to manage once several burdens pile on. Success, therefore, has to mean more than keeping the crew alive. It has to mean preserving resilience. The more mature way to hear this is simple. Mars health is not an organ-by-organ queue where one problem waits politely for the previous one to finish. It is a feedback network. Radiation, gravity, ecology, workload, sleep, and isolation keep leaning on the same bodies. That is why the final step in the story is not a new hazard, but a new time scale. When trouble does appear, the crew cannot step outside that network and ask Earth to take over immediately. Help stays far away, and that distance changes every symptom. NASA's hazard framework matters here because it prevents a common mistake. Stress does not stay on the morale side of the ledger while immunity stays on the medical side. Poor sleep can blur judgment at the same time it slows recovery. A changing habitat ecology can alter what exposures the crew faces, while lower gravity keeps reshaping exercise and fatigue. The same tissues that have to close a wound or fight a minor infection are also carrying all of that background load. The twins study helps because it keeps the tone honest. Long missions can change gene expression, immune markers, and microbial patterns without delivering one master explanation or one cinematic failure. That is the lesson Mars would inherit. The question is not whether a single hormone or pathway explains everything. The question is whether the whole organism can hold enough resilience while several pressures keep leaning on it. This has a daily texture that is easy to overlook. Recovery from a small skin problem may take longer than expected. A mild respiratory issue may be harder to read because dust, microbes, workload, and radiation are all part of the same background. Even a steady, capable crew member may still be paying a biological price for chronic vigilance and limited privacy. Mars may never turn those costs into catastrophe. It can still make ordinary recovery less easy. That is why immune function and stress belong near the center of the Mars story rather than near the soft edges. They help decide whether the body can absorb the 1,000 small demands of settlement without quietly becoming harder to repair. A mission can succeed technically while leaving its crew biologically overworked. The more ambitious the settlement becomes, the more important that distinction is. Put simply, stress and immunity determine how expensive ordinary life feels to the body. If the system remains resilient, the crew can absorb irritation, repair small damage, and keep functioning without every demand leaving a mark. If resilience narrows, then the same habitat, the same workload, and the same exposures begin costing more than they once did. Mars may never announce that transition loudly. It may simply ask for a little more recovery and offer a little less in return. That subtle shift may be one of the hardest things for a settlement to notice in real time. People adapt to strain gradually. They often treat extra caution, slower recovery, or lower reserve as the new normal. Mars' health would therefore depend on a crew that keeps measuring itself honestly, rather than assuming that survival automatically means stability. This is another place where the difference between a short mission and a true settlement becomes important. Short missions can borrow from human reserve. Settlements have to preserve that reserve. If stress and immune strain slowly erode it, the cost may appear first as smaller margins rather than as obvious disease. Mars would therefore reward a crew that takes subtle biological drift seriously long before anyone is tempted to call it failure. Seen that way, resilience becomes one of the most valuable resources a base possesses, right alongside oxygen, water, and power. What matters is the body's ability to keep recovering from ordinary life. If Mars spends that reserve a little faster than the crew can rebuild it, the settlement may stay functional while becoming less forgiving year by year. On Earth, one of the most powerful pieces of human health infrastructure is not a machine. It is closeness. Closeness to specialists, closeness to hospitals, closeness to diagnostic equipment, closeness to a second opinion when something feels wrong. NASA's human health material keeps noting that Mars imposes a one-way communication delay that can reach roughly 22 minutes. That number is easy to file under navigation or morale. It belongs there too. But it is also a medical number because it changes what happens when a symptom needs interpretation now. A headache on Earth can stay a headache while someone quickly asks whether it might be more. An eye change can lead to prompt specialist input. A strange cough can trigger imaging, testing, and multiple people looking at the same case. A fall can be worked up with equipment that most individuals never even think about until they need it. Mars strips away that background. A crew would still have training, tools, protocols, and communication with Earth. What it would not have is immediate takeover by a larger medical system. The first hospital on Mars would be the crew itself. That makes autonomy a bodily burden, not just a badge of competence. Crew members would have to notice, interpret, stabilize, and decide before Earth could respond in real time. The delay applies whether the problem is dust irritation, a musculoskeletal injury, a vision change, a strange infection, or something the crew cannot identify cleanly. The habitat may be technically advanced, but it is still finite. Privacy is finite. Skill coverage is finite. Diagnostic certainty is finite. Every medical event unfolds in that smaller circle first. The distance changes the meaning of minor problems because it changes how quickly uncertainty can be reduced. On Earth, some symptoms matter less because escalation pathways are so close. On Mars, the same symptom may carry more weight simply because interpretation is slower and options are fewer. A crew member can remain functional while quietly wondering whether a problem is benign or the start of something larger. That psychological load is part of the medical load. Delayed help does not only change treatment, it changes what a body sensation means when nobody nearby can settle the question quickly. This is where all the earlier systems return in a more practical light. Bone weakening matters more when imaging and orthopedic support are remote. Circulatory instability matters more when a fainting episode happens in a sealed habitat that is also an engineering system. Vision changes matter more when eye expertise arrives late. Dust exposure matters more when irritation must be assessed locally. Radiation matters more because the whole mission is already managing it with limited external rescue. Medical distance does not invent the hazards. It makes them harder to triage, harder to contextualize, and harder to answer quickly. NASA's emphasis on autonomy therefore deserves to be heard with more gravity than the word sometimes gets. Autonomy is not simply heroic independence. It is a workload that includes diagnosis, decision quality, conflict management, fatigue, and care burden. If one person is injured, others become caregivers while also remaining crew. If several people are strained at once, the settlement's medical margin narrows fast. The social system and the physiological system stop being separable. Team composition, trust, training breadth, and emotional steadiness become part of health protection. This is also the right place to separate survival from comfort one last time. A Mars mission may be technically reachable before it is medically comfortable. The ship can arrive, the habitat can work, water can be processed, radiation can be reduced, muscles can be trained, bones can be monitored, dust can be filtered. Yet if every meaningful symptom still unfolds under delay, then the body is living inside an unfinished experiment. Engineering can create reachability before biology and medicine create confidence. That is not an argument against going. It is an argument for understanding what going really means. So delayed help becomes the final lens through which the rest of the story sharpens. Mars does not need one perfect catastrophe to threaten human health. It only needs to keep the crew slightly farther from certainty, slightly farther from immediate intervention, and slightly more dependent on local judgment while all the other environmental pressures continue. A planet can be reachable before it is easy on the body. It can even be livable before it is forgiving. That is what makes Mars medically serious. The world may allow settlement before it allows anything like ordinary health. NASA's figure of up to about 22 minutes one way to Earth is often repeated because it is dramatic, but the medical meaning becomes clearer when it is made ordinary. If a crew member develops chest pain, visual distortion, a strange fever, or a hard fall, nobody on Earth can step into that moment with them. The first response belongs to the people already in the room. That changes what training means. It changes what onboard diagnostics mean. It changes what emotional steadiness means. Delayed help does not simply slow advice. It changes who must carry uncertainty during the first and most consequential part of every event. The finite nature of a habitat makes that sharper. There are fewer hands, fewer specialties, fewer replacement tools, and fewer ways to separate sick time from work time. If one person becomes the patient, someone else becomes the caregiver, while still remaining part of the crew that has to keep life support, maintenance, and mission tasks moving. Medical events therefore spread socially as well as biologically. The distance to Earth turns care into a settlement-wide burden rather than a private episode. That is why Mars autonomy should be heard as a health requirement rather than as a heroic slogan. A good crew will need broad competence, emotional steadiness, and trust, not because those traits sound admirable, but because the planet forces the crew to be its own first clinic, first monitoring team, and first line of uncertainty management. When everything is going well, that reality may sit quietly in the background. When anything starts to drift, it moves to the center very fast. This final point also changes how we should hear success stories. A base that is busy, productive, and technically impressive may still be operating with a narrow medical margin. The crew can be brave, skilled, and adaptive, while living in a place where one unusual symptom still carries more danger than it would on Earth, simply because response pathways are slower and smaller. Delayed help, therefore, does not sit at the end of the story as one more hazard. It reveals the scale of all the others. It also reveals why Mars demands humility from medicine as much as from engineering. A crew can prepare broadly, carry diagnostics, rehearse procedures, and still face moments where uncertainty stays larger than anyone would accept on Earth. The planet's distance guarantees that some part of care will remain local improvisation shaped by training, trust, and limited resources. That is not failure. It is the medical reality of living far from the planet that built the human body and the systems that usually protect it. The value of stating that plainly is that it protects the story from false heroism. Mars crews would not need to be mythical. They would need to be capable under conditions that ask too much of too few people. Delayed care is one of the clearest reasons why success on Mars and ease on Mars are not the same thing. It also clarifies why medicine on Mars can never be separated from the rest of settlement design. Crew size, privacy, training depth, communication systems, spare equipment, and emotional trust all become part of the same medical margin. Distance turns those social and engineering choices into bodily consequences. That is the final pattern running through the whole documentary. Mars keeps turning ordinary supports into active parts of human physiology. That is why even a minor symptom would sound different there. A cough, a headache, a strange rash, blurred vision, or lingering fatigue may all carry more meaning because the path from sensation to certainty is longer and narrower. Mars does not merely delay help, it changes the emotional and medical weight of noticing that something feels wrong. The human body was built inside one very specific planet. One full gravity, thick air, broad magnetic shielding, open water and weather cycles. A microbial world that was never sealed down to a few rooms, doctors and hospitals close enough that most people treat rescue as part of the background. Mars removes that background almost completely. It does not only ask whether human beings can land there, it asks which parts of an Earth-built body remain stable once Earth itself is gone. That is why the real answer was never going to be a simple list of dangers. Mars is not just cold, dusty, and far away. It is a coupled environment. Lower gravity can touch bone, muscle, circulation, fluid distribution, and the eyes at the same time. Radiation keeps shaping how people build and where they hide. Dust and perchlorates keep testing the line between outside and inside. A closed habitat becomes a living ecology rather than a neutral shell. Stress, immune change, and delayed medical help keep leaning on everything else. The hardest unresolved number in all of this is still the one that sounds easiest to summarize: 0.38 G. We know it is better than zero for many human functions. We do not know whether it is enough to keep multiple systems stable over years. That uncertainty reaches farther than any one body system. It decides whether Mars is merely survivable or whether it can become physically sustainable. And those are very different milestones. So the changed mental model is this: a Mars settlement could keep people alive before it keeps them unchanged. It could keep them productive before it keeps them fully healthy. It could keep them functioning before it proves that their bones, muscles, blood, vision, immunity, and recovery remain close to Earth normal over long stretches of time. The body does not care about the symbolic victory of living on another world. It answers the environment it is given. That is the boundary worth remembering. A Mars settlement could be real, impressive, and historically successful, while still asking its residents to live inside more maintenance, more uncertainty, and less biological margin than human beings have ever accepted as normal. A crew might sleep safely under shielding, drink carefully processed water, exercise hard enough to preserve muscle, clean dust off every threshold, and still be answering the same unresolved question in the background. Is the planet supporting the body well enough, or are the machines only slowing the price of living there? That question is why Mars should probably be described as an unfinished human environment, rather than as a second Earth or a simple outpost. It may become workable. It may even become routine in some operational sense. The deeper standard is harsher. Can people live there for years without watching too many systems drift away from the conditions that made them healthy in the first place? Until the answer is clearer, every successful habitat, rover trip, and long stay would still be part exploration and part physiological experiment. That may be the clearest way to hear Mars at all. Not as a place that instantly destroys the body, not as a place that becomes ordinary once the machines work, as a world that turns human life into a long test of what Earth was doing for us all along. Reaching Mars would be one achievement. Learning whether the body can stay itself there would be another. Until that answer exists, survival and long-term bodily stability have to remain two different things. That does not make Mars hopeless. It makes Mars exacting. The better we understand that distinction, the more honestly we can talk about settlement. A human being may live on Mars. The harder question is how much Earth has to be rebuilt around that person every day to keep the body recognizably itself.